What really happened in a medieval battle? Forget the movies, forget the gleaming armor and heroic soundtracks. It was chaos, blood, and blind panic. Most soldiers couldn't even hear the signal to attack. The guy blowing the horn, he was probably sipping wine behind a wall because medieval horn players had the highest survival rate in the army, right behind the kings who never showed up. Within the first 15 seconds of battle, a good chunk of the front line would already be on the ground, tripped by uneven ground, loose roots, or just someone else's panicked feet. Medieval battlefields weren't tidy open lawns. They were churned up pits of mud and surprise hazards designed by nature to make sure your grand entrance ended in a faceplant. There's nothing quite as intimidating as falling flat and screaming, "Ow, my ankle." Forget charging like the heroes in epic poems. You inched forward in a jittery, sweating mass, legs shaky from hours of waiting in tight formation. The man beside you was panting, drenched in sweat, reeking of old onions and sheer terror. Breath mints didn't exist, which might explain all the yelling. Shouting wasn't for morale, it was for oxygen control. Screaming was one way to inhale without choking on someone else's garlic breath. Everyone bellowed, but nobody knew what they were yelling. Orders were lost in the chaos. Most men shouted just to keep panic from swallowing them whole. Modern studies show that around 70% of soldiers in combat make involuntary noises they don't even remember. If you translated most medieval battle cries, they'd probably mean something like, "Mum, please, I changed my mind." Then came the first real hit. A stranger's shield smashed into yours. Your ears rang, though you weren't sure if it was from the impact or the guy next to you accidentally headbutting your helmet. The sound was overwhelming. No glorious war anthem, just an endless wall of groans, screams, steel against steel, and sometimes steel against flesh. Your shield arm quivered violently from absorbing the blow. It shook so badly, it felt like your grandchildren would inherit the tremors. 2 minutes in, and your carefully planned formation had collapsed into a single priority: don't fall. Hitting the ground meant being trampled into the mud by your own side. The earth turned slick, spattered with blood, spit, and everything else that comes out of terrified humans. Your arms screamed. The sun roasted you inside your sweat-soaked gambeson. Medieval armor, part protection, part torture device, and the worst weight loss system ever invented. You could lose 15 pounds of sweat, or your head, whichever came first. Your universe shrank to a 5-foot radius of chaos. All you saw were panicked eyes behind battered helmets, just as lost as yours. In that moment, you and your opponent silently agreed. Whoever called this glorious deserved a front row seat in hell, and that was only the beginning. If you somehow survived the first crush of bodies, the next phase of battle was even messier. Real medieval combat didn't look like duels. It looked like a bar fight during a riot. It wasn't clean or honourable. It was elbows, boots, fists, blades, and dogpiles. Warriors didn't seek noble one-on-one matchups. They dogpiled the weak. 5-on-1 wasn't dishonourable. It was smart. Knights didn't follow a sacred code of chivalry in the heat of battle. They followed a much simpler rule: survive. The "I want to make it home in one piece" code always beat the chivalric one. And honestly, can you blame them? The crush of bodies made proper sword technique about as useful as ballet lessons in a stampede. You had maybe 6 inches, if you were lucky, to maneuver your weapon. Forget those elegant sword arcs you see in movies. When you're shoulder to shoulder with terrified, sweaty men, swordplay turns into an awkward game of poke the guy in front of you like you're jabbing someone who stole your spot on a medieval subway. And here's the kicker: swords weren't even the main killers. Battlefield grave analysis shows most fatal injuries came from downward blows to the top of the head or neck. Exactly what happens when someone goes down and 5 other guys immediately decide it's curb stomping time. Medieval tactics weren't about dueling honourably. They were more like knock him down, stomp a bit, then maybe give him one more for good measure, just to be sure he's not faking. Ironically, one of the most effective parts of your sword wasn't the blade. It was the pommel. That's the heavy metal knob at the end of the handle, which turns out to be great for bashing things. Enter the murder stroke, a technique where you grip the sword by the blade and swing the handle like a hammer. Yes, it's literally called the murder stroke, which might be the most refreshingly honest name in the entire history of warfare. Helmets saved lives, but also created new problems, like turning your head into a pressure cooker. With vision reduced to a tiny slit and no ventilation, your helmet became a personal solar oven. After 20 minutes of fighting, the inside could reach over 100 degrees. A lot of soldiers didn't fall from wounds. They passed out from heat. So yes, medieval knights basically fought inside mobile saunas while being actively murdered. Bravery or insanity? Honestly, it's a fine line. If you fell during the chaos, you had about 2 seconds to get up. Not because of some code of honour, but because 2 seconds is how long it took for someone's boot to crush your spine, or for a spear to find that one unarmoured patch you forgot about. Archaeological digs show that many bodies were found face down in just a few inches of mud. Not a glorious final stand, just quiet, grim suffocation with a side of panic. Injuries often came from weird, chaotic angles. Sure, your armour might stop a blade from the front, but what about the guy to your left, or the guy behind you? A typical soldier took hits from at least 3 different directions every minute. Your head would spin trying to keep up, which is ironic because not getting your head spun off was kind of the whole point. More than anything, it was the sheer crush of humanity, trampling, suffocating, stumbling, that killed. Not skill, not honour, just physics, panic and poor ventilation. And if by some insane stroke of luck you crawled out of this living meat grinder with all your limbs intact, congratulations. You are now a prime target for flying weapons. Let's talk tools of the trade. Those gleaming swords in museums, forget 'em. Real battlefield weapons were rough, brutal instruments with one job: bust through whatever stood between you and your enemy's squishiest parts. Take axes. Not the ceremonial kind. We're talking firewood choppers turned into people choppers. Just sharpen the edge, swing it hard, and let gravity do the rest. No formal training required. Axe combat was basically the medieval version of swing and hope. But there was a downside. Once the axe bit into something, be it wood, armour, or an unfortunately placed rib, it often got stuck. Bad news. Battlefield digs have shown many axe wielders died while trying to yank their weapon back out. Getting your axe lodged in someone was the medieval equivalent of your phone dying at 99%, deeply frustrating and very possibly fatal. Then there were spears, the unsung heroes of medieval warfare. Up to 70% of medieval soldiers carried them. Why? Because they were cheap, easy to make, and didn't require years of training. Just jab the pointy end toward the bad guy and repeat. Voila. You're a soldier. A simple wooden shaft with a metal tip could be mass-produced with ease, even by kingdoms that couldn't afford much else. The biggest advantage? Reach. You could jab someone from 6 feet away while they were still trying to close the distance. It was the medieval version of social distancing, with sharper consequences. But there was a catch. Maneuverability. In tight, chaotic formations, spears often became less of a weapon and more of a liability. Battlefield accounts mention plenty of oops moments, accidental stabbings delivered to allies rather than enemies. Some soldiers got poked more by their buddies than the opposing army. A painful reminder to always watch your back, especially when your friend is holding a 7-foot pointy stick. Maces stepped in to solve a problem swords couldn't handle: armour. As plate armour got better, slicing it was like trying to cut a tin can with a spoon. The solution? Don't cut, crush. A mace was a heavy metal ball on a stick, specifically engineered to bash armour inward and turn ribs into jelly. No finesse, just physics, pain, and percussive problem solving. Interestingly, some religious knights preferred maces because they technically didn't shed blood, which meant they could still feel holy while turning people into medieval pudding. Gotta love that divine loophole. I didn't stab him, I just collapsed his chest cavity. We're good, right God? Despite their fame, swords weren't actually all that common on medieval battlefields. Why? Price. A good sword could cost as much as a small house or a very large cow. They required rare steel, expert blacksmithing, and years of practice to wield effectively. Only nobles, knights, or career soldiers typically carried them, and those elegant movie sword fights? Pure fantasy. Swords broke a lot. Battlefield finds show that many swords had been repaired repeatedly before their final outing. Nothing ruins your heroic last stand like raising your gleaming blade, only for it to snap in half on the first swing, leaving you holding what now amounts to a very expensive tent stake. Then came the improvised weapons, the tools of the desperate. When you're a peasant conscripted into battle, you bring what you've got. Farm tools became instruments of war. Flails, pitchforks, sharpened hoes, and even angry-looking shovels all made appearances in the chaos. Historical records show that in some battles, as many as 20% of foot soldiers wielded modified agricultural gear. And these weren't just symbolic, they worked. There's something uniquely horrifying about being defeated by a man wielding the same shovel he buried his potatoes with. Death by sword sounds noble. Death by garden tool, that's just humiliating. Imagine arriving in the afterlife trying to explain that one. Weapon quality varied wildly. While the elite showed off gleaming, perfectly balanced works of art, most foot soldiers fought with factory-line mediocrity. Bent blades, loose handles, and weapons that looked like they were made by someone on a deadline, and possibly blindfolded. But hey, when your life depends on a rusty mace held together with twine, you don't get picky. Rust, loose handles, and poorly tempered metal were just part of the charm. Many weapons broke mid-fight, forcing their owners to scramble for anything vaguely pointy, sticks, rocks, or whatever fell out of the last guy's hands. As these crude tools found flesh, medieval fighters quickly learned that armour wasn't invincibility, it just made running away harder. And once those brutal weapons connected, the true horror began. All the weapons we've talked about, they weren't meant to look cool. They were meant to reduce the human body to meat, and they did a disturbingly good job. Armour offered some help, sure, but not nearly as much as you'd hope. Chainmail might stop a sword slash once, maybe twice. But take a direct blow from an axe or mace, and the chainmail didn't block the damage, it joined it. The metal links would collapse into your skin, turning your armour into a painful part of the wound. Battlefield medical records, yes, those existed, show about 40% of armoured knight casualties had crushed bones, even though their armour was technically intact. Think of armour as medieval bubble wrap. Great for the first impact, but after that, you're just listening to things crunch. A clean hit to the shoulder might mean saying goodbye to your entire arm. Medieval weapons weren't in the business of precision. They mangled, shredded, and tore. Most warriors who lost limbs didn't die instantly. They died from blood loss, or worse, from what happened after. Forget movie scenes where heroes fight on with gaping wounds. Real blood loss hits fast. The average human has around 10 pints of blood. Lose just 2, and you're on the ground seeing stars. Lose more, and the curtain drops. Reports suggest many soldiers bled out in under 5 minutes. Sometimes they didn't even realise they were hit until the world tilted and their legs gave up. Internal injuries from blunt weapons were even nastier than open wounds. No dramatic cuts, just pain, confusion, and dying quietly on the inside. A mace blow might leave your skin untouched, but pulverise your ribs, rupture your spleen, or send your brain sloshing in its casing. Medieval doctors had a name for this phenomenon, the "he seemed fine a second ago" condition. Not every injury was cinematic. Teeth went flying when helmets took hits. Eyes got pierced by splinters from shattered shields. Minor wounds that today would mean a quick ER visit often turned into death sentences back then. Infection was the real killer. Monastic hospital records show that for every soldier who died in battle, at least 3 more died afterward from infected wounds. No antibiotics, no antiseptic, just prayer and pain. There were no medics rushing to your side. If you were lucky, another soldier might tie a belt around your limb to slow the bleeding, or sear the wound shut with a red-hot dagger. That was battlefield medicine. The medieval pain scale had 2 settings. I can still swing this sword, and, please, just finish me off. Field hospitals, when they even existed, were often nothing more than tents with straw-covered floors and a lot of groaning. Surgical tools weren't sterilised. At best, they were wiped on someone's sleeve and called clean. Battlefield surgery success rates hovered around 30%, and most procedures boiled down to one solution: amputation. Not always because it was medically required, but because it was fast. Efficiency over accuracy. If in doubt, cut it off. But the physical pain was only half the horror. The mental damage ran deep. Many survivors reported their minds fracturing during combat, especially after witnessing grotesque injuries or watching a friend die screaming. The medieval battlefield wasn't just a test of muscle, it was psychological warfare wrapped in steel and panic. As the chaos dragged on, your brain began to betray you. Something strange happened to the minds of even the toughest fighters. Something no training could fix and no courage could override. Where am I? That question echoed in many heads just minutes into combat. With constant spinning to meet threats from all directions and no clear visual markers, most soldiers quickly lost all sense of orientation. Without modern radios or maps, or even a guy shouting directions above the clamour, units splintered apart fast. Analysis of battle records shows that roughly 60% of medieval fighters had no clue which direction they were facing after the first clash. This confusion explains why some battles ended with both armies retreating at the same time. History's bloodiest version of "you go first." Even figuring out who was on your side became a nightmare. Armies often wore specific colours or emblems, but after 5 minutes of fighting, those were soaked in blood, mud, and panic. Spotting friend from foe became a coin toss. In the heat of battle, men struck down their own comrades with frightening regularity. Records from the Battle of Towton in 1461 show that nearly 1 in 10 casualties may have come from friendly fire. When thousands of soldiers are swirling in a chaos tornado, one bad assumption is all it takes. Then came one of the most terrifying moments. Is this my blood? You look down. You're soaked in red. But is it yours, your enemies, your best friends? blood spray from nearby kills could cover you head to toe, and in the mayhem, you often couldn't tell if you were injured unless you stopped to check. Something you definitely didn't have time to do while dodging an incoming flail. Many soldiers described the surreal experience of being completely drenched in blood, convinced they were dying, only to realize they were physically fine. Others, meanwhile, felt perfectly okay, right up until they collapsed from massive blood loss. In battle, your body doesn't always sound the alarm until it's too late. Do I swing now, or just keep ducking? That wasn't a question you asked consciously. By the time the battle was in full swing, decisions weren't really decisions anymore. Your thinking brain couldn't keep up with the chaos. Thoughtful choices got replaced by pure instinct. If you'd trained enough, that training kicked in like muscle memory on autopilot, your body running choreography your mind barely remembered. Like a dance routine you learned years ago and suddenly nail, only this time it involves dodging death instead of hitting the beat. Many survivors of medieval battles later said they couldn't recall what they actually did. Their bodies fought on while their minds checked out. It's like driving home and suddenly realizing you can't remember the last 10 minutes, except instead of missing your exit, you might have stabbed 7 people and blocked a mace with your face. The truth is, the human brain wasn't built to process the sheer terror of hand-to-hand combat. Fear, rage, and confusion took turns behind the wheel. Modern studies show that under extreme threat, your brain's higher functions simply shut down. Logic, strategy, gone. You're left with caveman reflexes and adrenaline-fueled twitch responses. For medieval soldiers, that meant all the careful tactics, battle plans, and noble ideals flew out the window within minutes. You weren't swinging at people anymore. You were swinging at shapes, anything that moved. Vision narrowed, depth perception vanished. You didn't see knights or infantry. You saw motion, flashes of steel, a smear of colour. A blur on your left. Better hit it just in case. Whether it was a friend or a foe became secondary to survival. Many fighters described an eerie state of detachment where people stopped looking like people. They were just moving targets, obstacles, threats in a blur of noise and metal. Eventually, your body took over completely. You fought without thinking, like watching a puppet version of yourself from the back of your skull. Some soldiers described time behaving strangely, stretching out into endless seconds or vanishing altogether. A moment that felt like 10 minutes might have been 5 seconds. A 2-hour clash, over in the blink of an eye. This foggy, semi-conscious combat trance has a name now: battle mind. It's what happens when your body fights and your brain just sort of watches. And when all that mental overload became too much, when the weight of exhaustion, blood, and raw panic finally broke through, many soldiers made the smartest decision available. They ran. Forget the last stand. Forget cinematic slow-motion deaths. Most medieval soldiers weren't looking to become legends. They were trying to stay alive. And when things got really bad, fleeing was often the only rational choice. Records show that up to 40% of soldiers on a medieval battlefield ran away before the fighting hit its peak. And who can blame them? When honour and survival go head-to-head, the legs usually win. Running away wasn't seen as shameful, at least not by the average foot soldier. The shame came from nobles and knights who had reputations, family names, and songs they wanted written about them. But for peasants, the only legacy they were interested in was survival. Their motto was simple: "I'd really like to see my family again." Medieval soldiers even had a saying: "The graveyard is full of heroes, the tavern is full of runners." Most battles didn't end because one side was brilliantly defeated. They ended because someone panicked first. Once a few soldiers bolted, the rest followed. Panic spreads faster than plague. The Battle of Hastings is a great example. Saxon fighters broke, ran, regrouped, then ran again. It was less glorious last stand, more really bad game of freeze tag. When escape wasn't an option, fighters got creative. Some played dead, others faked injuries or begged for mercy. A few hid behind wagons, trees, or anything that wasn't swinging a weapon. One French soldier famously survived by crawling inside a dead horse and hiding there for hours. Not exactly bedtime story material for the grandkids, but hey, he lived. Of course, running had its own risks. If your comrades thought you were deserting, they might cut you down on the spot, and in heavy armour, running was basically sprinting in a sauna wearing cast iron. A lot of knights didn't get caught because they were slow. They got caught because they were wheezing puddles after 100 yards. Those who did escape learned something valuable. Victory wasn't about glory, it was about still being vertical. We tend to imagine victory with trumpets and flag waving, crowds of heroes, emotional speeches. Medieval victories, not quite so Instagram worthy. If you were alive at the end, congratulations, you won. That was the only criteria. No medals, no feasts, just the quiet, stunned realization that death passed you over, for now. It was like the bloodiest game of musical chairs in history. When the music stopped, if you were still on your feet, you got to keep playing life. The end of a battle wasn't met with roaring cheers. It was met with silence. Men sat down where they stood, too exhausted, bloodied, or mentally shattered to speak. The typical victory cheer sounded less like hurrah and more like thank God that's over. Does anyone have water and pants without holes in them? Afterward, it was all about practical survival. You wiped the blood off your face, hopefully not your own, and checked for injuries you hadn't felt during the fight. You looked for friends, if they were still around, and collected weapons that hadn't broken in half. The post-battle checklist was refreshingly simple. Arms, still attached. Legs, still moving. Friends, some accounted for. Enemies, preferably more dead than yours. Overall, solid outcome. Then came the looting. The battlefield turned into a grim swap meet. Armour was stripped from the dead, regardless of allegiance. If someone's boots looked better than yours, you took them. Medieval recycling programs were brutal, but efficient. Nothing went to waste, especially if it sparkled or had a good edge. And finally, you celebrated the only way that made sense, by drinking whatever alcohol you could find. Not because the day was won, but because you weren't dead, and because your brain needed help forgetting everything it had just seen. One English chronicler noted that after a major battle, the surviving men drank for 3 straight days, as if trying to drown their memories in bottomless mugs of ale. Medieval victory parties weren't about triumph. They were about escape. Less we are the champions, and more please let me forget what I just witnessed through the miracle of alcohol. While some drank themselves into oblivion, others packed into overcrowded medical tents. Field hospitals, if you could even call them that, had fatality rates between 25% and 50%. The medieval version of a waiting room had just 2 categories: might live and probably won't. And which one you landed in often depended less on your wounds and more on whether the surgeon had slept or had something stronger than beer for breakfast. The physical aftermath stuck around long after the swords were sheathed. Bruises showed up in places you didn't even remember being hit. Sleep was elusive, and when it came, it wasn't peaceful. You jerked awake, swinging at invisible enemies. Nothing quite says seasoned warrior like accidentally clocking your spouse in the face during a nightmare about a guy who's been dead since last Thursday or last century, and somewhere out in the field a shattered helmet still sat on a crooked stick, a quiet marker, a reminder Medieval battlefields weren't cleaned up. They were left to rot and be reclaimed by the land. Grass grew over bones, metal rusted and sank into the mud, waiting centuries to be rediscovered by some poor farmer wondering why his plough just hit something other than rock. What the movies call victory, triumph, glory, a hero's welcome was, in truth, the opening chapter of a different kind of war. One fought in silence. No flags, no fanfare, just broken bodies, haunted minds, and the slow, grinding realization that the worst wounds aren't always visible, that the real battle begins when the killing stops, against memory, guilt, and the horrifying clarity of what human beings will do to one another when given the chance.